I start this episode with a story that, while apocryphal, is apropos of our project. Michelangelo, one of the most important figures of the Renaissance, was asked about how he goes about producing marble sculptures. In some tellings of this story, the particular sculpture in question is that of David. Michelangelo is reported to have said, "The sculpture is already complete within the marble block before I start my work. It's already there. I just have to chisel away the superfluous material." This quotation captures the Neoplatonic idea of the realm of the forms. In this case, the form of a young man as represented by David that is itself perfect, and that the people we encounter are imperfect shadows of the form of the human that exists only in the realm of the forms. The idea of beginning with a block of marble and removing everything that is not sculpture has tremendous resonance for us in our ambition to build a brain. I'm Josh Young, and this is Playing Odd, a podcast about complexity and information in the natural world. Episode 10, An Impression of the World. In this episode, we will use all that we have learned in the past 9 episodes to complete our task. But we will do it by changing the nature of the task itself. It seems impossible that we would be able to construct the great complexity that is the brain by employing genetic compression, self-assembly, fractal processes with iteration, and I believe that this is true. There's simply not enough information to construct a connectome. But perhaps we're going about this the wrong way. If it is too ambitious for us to carve the sculpture, can we instead endeavor to construct the marble? In terms of neurogenesis, what would this marble look like? It would have to be a structure that lends itself to being molded into the connectome, and like the marble, it is a structure that would need to have superfluous material. This is an achievable way forward, and amazingly, it is the one that evolution has chosen to take. To build our neurological marble, we need to make sure that we have bundles of neurons that follow paths that include those that will be part of the connectome, but also include those that are of no use to us. We can visualize this as directions to get from home to work. What we would like is a set of instructions that tells us where to turn and gives us landmarks. Generally, when we think about instructions, we start out with nothing and then build our instructions up from there. But let's take the opposite approach. Let's say that we start with a set of instructions, of directions, that describes turning on every possible street in every possible direction. That instruction set would be extremely large and would not be at all helpful in getting us to work. However, we can be certain that somewhere within all of those possibilities is the proper set of instructions for our commute. We can then remove those instructions that do not get us to work to leave only those that describe the actual appropriate path. The set of instructions that includes every possible turn, every possible direction on every possible street is the marble, and we need to be Michelangelo and simply remove those instructions that are not part of our commute. Is this really the way brains are built? Is there really an overabundance of connections that are then carved away to reveal the sculpture that is the finished connectome? Well, if that were true, we would see the bizarre and counterintuitive case that the baby has more neurons than the adult. Surely this cannot be the case. And yet, it is. At birth, we have about 100 billion neurons, and as we grow to adulthood, an apparently superfluous 14 billion are carved away. This reduction in neurons is not equal in all parts of the brain, but is especially prevalent in the neocortex, that portion of the brain involved in what we think of as higher functions like reasoning and language. If we look at synapses, the numbers are even more dramatic. By the age of about 2 or 3, we have our peak number of synapses, and they add to about 1 quadrillion. As we mature, between a third and half of these synapses are removed. In this context, removing is the result of apoptosis, what is sometimes called programmed cell death. Although difficult to imagine, apoptosis is evident to anyone who has ever had the fortune to play with a preverbal child, with a baby. John McWhorter, an associate professor of linguistics at Columbia University, asks us to imagine beatboxing, the musical performance in which a beatboxer emulates the sounds of musical instruments and environmental sounds in an entirely a cappella fashion. McWhorter makes the obvious point that the beatboxer can only make sounds which can be made, and points out that many of these sounds are the sounds that we ourselves made when we were infants. A very young preverbal child will make all sorts of noises with the mouth and the throat, and those noises that are recognized by the parents as components of their language are reinforced. The reason that the Khoisan can include clicks in their spoken language is because these sounds were reinforced during their early formative years. The reason that you and I cannot make these sounds is because, like many other sounds, they were pruned by a sort of apoptosis of diction. Successful beatboxers are perhaps rediscovering sounds that they themselves made as infants. The idea of overproduction of neurons and synapses with subsequent cell death sounds enormously wasteful, but it is only wasteful in the sense of material and not in the sense of information. In the same way that our fractal snowflake can have infinite intricacy but very little information, the infant brain can contain more neurons but less information than the adult brain. We have our marble in the form of the overabundance of neurons in the infant's neocortex and synapses in the toddler's neocortex. And now we have our chisel in the form of apoptosis. What we are missing is our sculptor. I have divided this podcast series into 3 parts, as will surely now be evident. Episodes 1 through 5 dealt largely with genetics and compression and an examination of the information content of the genome. Episodes 6 through 10 dealt with complexity and self-organization. Episodes 10 through 12 are about the syntheses of these 2 sets of ideas. The exploration of complex adaptive systems was interesting, but in the end, we decided that these complex systems do not add any information, but rather add an additional way of dealing with existing information. I want to make the argument that in the adaptive nature of these systems, we will find our sculptor. Let's return to our example of the stock market. When the stock price in the technology sector is rising, and a new bit of information arrives that causes the prices of stocks in the sector to fall, the sector undergoes a phase transition, in the sense that the sector acts differently before and after the news story has broken. Viewed from the perspective of information flow, the market has ingested information and has become changed by it. It is almost as if this information has left a metaphorical impression on the system that has changed its shape. If another news story arrives that also transforms the behavior of the market, the influence of the first story is not completely gone. The system has ingested a second story, and the system will continue to change as further news arrives. But the system does not forget old news, even as it alters itself to accommodate the new. The complex system ingests and adapts, and this is the result of interaction and interdependency of its parts. The brain does the same. If we remember back to episode 7, in which we talked about concentration gradients and chemical signals that direct the growth of neurons, it will come as no surprise that these signals are also employed during the process of apoptosis, the development of synaptic weights, and of neuroplasticity. This production is cued by ingestion of information from the environment. In the case of refractive amblyopia, lazy eye that arises from the uncorrected requirement for glasses in just one eye, too little information is ingested as a result of poor image quality being projected onto the patient's retina in that eye that will become lazy. This lack of information affects apoptosis in a way that prevents the reinforcement of connections in the visual system that cannot be overcome by later neuroplasticity. It is an example of exogenous information, external information, directly affecting the anatomy and brain function. It is evidence that some of the information for construction of the connectome arises from outside the organism, that is to say, from the world at large. Let us take the simplest case of which I can think. When I was a young child, our teacher would take us to a church with ornate carvings and would give us paper and crayon. Rather than asking us to draw the figures represented in the bas-relief, a task at which I was especially poor, we were told to lay the paper over the carving and gently rub the crayon over it, and that this rubbing would produce a facsimile of the bas-relief. Doing this, we would then see a picture appear on our paper. Let's examine the parts of this highly imperfect analogy. We can think of the paper as the brain, the crayon as apoptosis, and the process of rubbing the crayon over the paper, laying down thicker lines where the bas-relief rose up and lighter lines where the bas-relief dipped, as the adaptation that is characteristic of complex systems. We wind up with the art transferred to the paper. We understand the role of the paper, the role of the crayon, and the role of the process of rubbing. But from where did the information for this picture come? It did not come from the paper, nor from the crayon, nor from the process of rubbing. The information came from the external world. In this case, the picture on our page represents a literal impression of the world, but in the case of apoptosis and its role in development of our brains, it is a metaphorical impression of the world. But in both cases, the rich source of information is external to the object at hand. In episodes 1 through 5, we built our marble. In episodes 6 through 9, we built a system of rubbing in that we observe complex systems adapt to their environments. What is adaptation, if not the ingestion of information and the reformation of the system to accommodate this information? This is a profound insight in many ways. In episode 8, we talked about von Neumann machines and the idea that such a self-replicating machine would require not only the blueprint for its construction, but also a system to execute that blueprint. We are not built that way, at least in the development of our neocortex. Our system offloads the burden of much of the information of our construction to the environment itself. The brain cannot be built in isolation of its external environment. In another example, in the field of language acquisition, I will relate the sad story of a language deprivation experiment that Herodotus recounts in his histories of the Egyptian pharaoh Psamtik. Here I read from a modern English translation of Herodotus' History, Book 2. Now before Psamtik became king of Egypt, the Egyptians believed they were the oldest people on earth. But since Psamtik became king and wished to find out which people were the oldest, they believed that the Phrygians were older than they, and they than everybody else. Psamtik, when he was in no way able to learn by inquiry which people had first come into being, devised a plan by which he took 2 newborn children of the common people and gave them to a shepherd to bring up among his flocks. He gave instructions that no one was to speak a word in their hearing, that they were to stay by themselves in a lonely hut, and in due time the shepherd was to bring goats and give their children milk and do everything else necessary. Psamatux did this and gave these instructions because he wanted to hear what speech would first come from the children when they were past the age of indistinct babbling. And he had his wish, for one day, when the shepherd had done as he had been told for 2 years, both children ran to him, stretching out their hands and calling Bekos as he opened the door and entered. When he first heard this, he kept quiet about it. But when, coming often and paying careful attention, he kept hearing this same word, he told his master at last and brought the children into the king's presence as required. Psamatux then heard them himself and asked to what language the word Bekos belonged. He found it to be a Phrygian word signifying bread. Reasoning from this, the Egyptians acknowledged that the Phrygians were older than they. This is a story which I heard the priests of Hephaestus' temple in Memphis. The Greeks say, among many foolish things, that Psamatux had had the children reared by women whose tongues he had cut out. What would actually happen to such children? Documentation of cases of children raised without being spoken to or hearing any language reveal them to remain cognitively deficient. Without the ingestion of exogenous information, the construction of the functioning brain cannot be complete. And certainly the information flow is bidirectional. It is not merely that the child absorbs stimuli from the world, but in interacting with the world, the child can cause the world to generate further stimuli. When the child touches and manipulates an object, when the child vocalizes and then hears the vocalization, the child is providing input to the environment and then ingesting the information that arises from the environment as a result. When we say the child is learning about the world, it is far more profound than that. The child is, as we all are, part of the world, and a large part of the instructions for building us is not found within us at all. In this episode, we finally came to terms with the fact that the genome is simply insufficient to build an adult brain, but we built one anyway. We did this by recognizing that complex adaptive systems are information ingestion engines, and that it is a simpler task to create these ingestion engines and to build the substrate on which these complex systems will act than for us to design the final product. We see arise again the process-product dichotomy, and we see the singular importance of exogenous information. It is at this point that I wish to turn the entire project of this podcast on its head. The environment, the world, is indeed a rich source of information. But although this has served us greatly in our quest to construct a brain, it also presents a crisis. We have gone from having too little information to having far too much. How can we, with our enormous but finite brains, operate in a world in which information is essentially limitless and is far too much for us to ever understand? This crisis of reality will be the subject of our penultimate episode, and I can't wait to discuss it with you next week. Looking forward to that discussion. I'm Josh Young.